Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to another CEN seminar. I would like to quickly, before starting our session, remind everyone that the International Mind, Brain, and Education Society Conference is taking place in Belgium this year in July. It's an educational neuroscience conference designed for both researchers and educators. So the deadline for the early bird registration is going to be on the 1st of May, and the final one is going to be on the 26th of June. I believe all of us from the Center for Education Neuroscience will be there, and if you're interested in knowing more details, you can visit their website, imbis2024.org. I will also be putting the link in the chat. So now, without any further delay, I would like to welcome Dr. Rufan from Arizona State University. Dr. Rufan is an assistant professor of psychology in the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences in the new College of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at Arizona State University. Prior to this, she also received her PhD in applied psychology from New York University. And before joining Arizona State University, she was an assistant professor of psychology at Rutgers University, Camden. She mainly works with children, young children, families, and teachers from culturally, linguistically, and socioeconomically diverse backgrounds. Her work also focuses on language and cognitive development, parent-child interactions, home and classroom learning environments, as well as sociocultural and ecological influences of early childhood development. Dr. Rufan also develops community-based early language interventions and language assessment tools, and her work has been published in peer-reviewed journals such as Child Development and Frontiers in Psychology. Today, she's going to be talking to us about the challenges and opportunities of supporting children's language and literacy learning environment in disadvantaged households in the United States. Now I will hand it over to you, Rufan.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to share my screen so you can see my slides. Sorry, give me 1 second. I need to close out the Zoom so I can see my full slide. Can everyone hear me okay and see the slides okay? Awesome. So let's get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Rufan Luo. I'm from Arizona State University. It's my great pleasure to be here. And today I'm going to share with you my research findings on children's language and literacy learning in disadvantaged households here in the States. And we will be talking about the challenges these children and families face and some potential opportunities for us to support them. Okay. As we all know, there has been a growing, I'm sorry, I think the Zoom is like popping up a little bit. Let me move this one. Okay, good. So as we all know, there's been a growing diversity among the US population. You can see from this graph that the younger the age, the more diverse the population is. And for children under the age of 10, over 50% of them are coming from ethnic minority background. And the diversity is also reflected in children's linguistic background. 1 in 3 children here in the US under the age of 5 are dual language learners who are learning both English and a home language at the same time. And many of them are coming from Spanish-speaking families. Unfortunately, for lots of these children from language or ethnic minority background, they're at a very high risk of living in poverty early on. So as you can see from this graph, those African American children and Latino American children are 2 to 3 times more likely to experience early childhood poverty compared to their non-Hispanic white peers. And there's been a similar pattern between English-speaking families and language minority families. So one negative consequence of this early childhood poverty rate is the achievement gap that children from ethnic minority background and low-income background lag behind their white and more affluent peers in math and reading skills at the beginning of their kindergarten. As you can see here, the gap is pretty large, about 6 to 13 months between these groups. So this really leads our attention to early childhood education. Researchers and practitioners have been working really hard trying to figure out ways to narrow the achievement gaps early on. And recently we have some good news. In a report published in 2016, this longitudinal study showed that from 1998 to 2010, the income-related school readiness gap has narrowed by about 10% in math and 16% in reading. So we are moving to the middle a little bit. But we still have a very long way to go because at the current rate, it's estimated that it will still take about 60 to 110 years to close the gap. So we need to do better, but at least we're making some progress. So the next question is, who did the trick? Who helped these children from disadvantaged background catch up with their peers? Well, one of the answers is parents. It turns out that differences in parenting can help explain about 25 to 50% of the school readiness gap. And when parents from low-income minority background provide their children with richer home learning environment by engaging their children in learning activities more often and provide more learning materials for their children at home, the school readiness gap starts to narrow over time. And I am particularly interested in children's home language and literacy experiences. These home language and literacy experiences, such as children's engagement in book reading activities at home or the number of books they have at home, are foundational for children to develop these early language skills, which is one of the best predictors of children's future school success. To give you one simple example, children's vocabulary skills at age 3 is a strong predictor of their reading skills in the 3rd grade, which is further closely related to how likely they're going to graduate from high school later. And home language and literacy experiences not only support children's development within the language domain, but also support children's development across other domains like their math and cognitive skills and their social emotional development. To give you an overall framework of my research interest, I'm especially interested in understanding children's home language and literacy experiences, and I conceptualize it as having 3 key components. The availability of language and literacy materials at home, like the number of children's books at home, and children's engagement in language and literacy learning activities, like how frequently they read books with their parents, sing songs together, or share an oral story together, and the quality of children's language interactions during these activities. I'm also very interested in understanding how social cultural contexts like socioeconomic status, the family's immigration background, play a role in shaping children's home language and literacy experiences, which in turn predict children's language and cognitive outcomes. And the effect of home language and literacy environment do not always hold the same for children from diverse backgrounds. I'm also very interested in understanding whether the effect of home language and literacy environment might vary by different contextual factors and children's individual characteristics. And lastly, I'm very interested in transforming my basic scientific finding into practice by developing early language interventions for those children families from diverse backgrounds. So to give you an outline of today's presentation, we are first going to talk about some challenges children face in low-income language minority families. Specifically, we'll be talking about SES disparities in children's home literacy environment and their bilingual developmental outcomes. And next, we're going to talk about some opportunities for us to support children from low SES families. And I will specifically talk about the importance of attending to the diverse needs of children, even within the low SES population. We'll be talking about how the quality of language interaction play a differential role in children's language learning for children from different SES background and for children with different language skill levels. And lastly, I'll be talking about some useful strategies for us to develop culturally responsive early language interventions for children from disadvantaged families. And we'll be talking about community-based participatory research, CBPR, as a useful strategy for us to create intervention materials that really speak to our target population. So now let's take a look at the first topic, SES disparities in home literacy environment and bilingual development. So there's been lots of evidence showing that there's a language gap across different SES groups, that children from higher SES background, they also show better language outcomes in a variety of standard language assessments. And this type of language gap can be especially relevant for dual language learners who are coming from Spanish-speaking families, because here in the United States, nearly 30% of Spanish-English dual language learners are living in poverty in early childhood. And when we think about this language gap, it's important to further ask about the potential mechanisms or the pathways through which SES impacts language outcomes. And one of the pathways is children's home literacy environment. Here, we conceptualize it as how many books children have at home and how often they engage in book reading activities with their parents. And researchers have shown that children from higher SES background, they tend to experience richer home literacy environment, which further predict better language outcomes. But when we think about this mechanism, this model, it's important to keep in mind that the deficit is not in the children or families, but rather in the system. That it's not that families or parents from low SES background, they don't want to support their children's language outcomes, or they don't want to engage their children in book reading, but rather they're facing lots of challenges. For example, lots of these families have very limited access to professional resources. So these parents might not be fully aware of the importance of early literacy environment for children's language development early on. And they could also have a really hard time finding learning materials like children's books in their area, especially in their home language. And poverty is often related to lots of financial and emotional stress, which can further prevent these parents from having quality time with their children. So there's been lots of studies so far testing out this model by looking at SES differences in children's language knowledge. That is, what children already know about a language, their vocabulary size or grammatical skills. But there is a missing piece here, is that we don't know whether there's also SES differences in children's language learning ability. That is, how efficiently can children learn language from the environment. In other words, we are asking if low SES children are presented with the same type of learning opportunities, can they learn as efficiently as others? So how do we test children's language learning ability? I'll give you an example. Say if I show you these 4 pictures of objects and I tell you that the fab is blue, show me the blue fab. Which object are you going to choose? So you might be thinking about the last object, right? Because first of all, based on the sentence, it must be a blue object. And we know that the first one is a crayon, the second one is a stroller, but we don't know the name of the third one. So that one must be fat. So the process we just described is called fast mapping. It means that we are using our existing vocabulary knowledge to rule out some possibilities and quickly map a new word to a novel object that we don't know the name of. And we also engage in certain language learning processes. So when we try to understand the verb, say if I tell you that, look, a boy is breathing, hey, a boy is breathing, can you find another one? Find a boy is breathing. And I show you the boy on the top as the example and ask you to choose from the three boys at the bottom. And you might be thinking, based on the sentence structure, it seems like breathe is a verb. So it must be connected to an action. So you're going to choose the first boy who is doing the same action as the exemplar. And this process is called syntactic bootstrapping, that we're using syntactic structures to infer the meaning of words. So these language learning processes, children can start to show their language learning ability in these processes at a very young age, at around age 2. And their language learning abilities continue to grow and develop over preschool years. So here we argue that these language learning ability can be environmental dependent, meaning that when you think about these language learning processes, a successful language learning not only requires you to have specific vocabulary and syntactic knowledge, like you need to know the meaning of blue, crayon, or stroller, but you also need to be able to quickly access and retrieve these linguistic information from the memory and use this information to process real-time language input. And all of these have been found to be closely related to one's overall knowledge of a language. So here we argue that it could be that language begets language. For those children with stronger language knowledge, it might be easier for them to further learn new language items from their language environment. So in this study, we are going to test this sequential pathway from socioeconomic status to home literacy environment to language knowledge to language learning ability. So we have two research questions. Does SES relate to DLL preschoolers' language learning ability in English and Spanish? And if so, what is the pathway? Our participants are 108 DLL children from Spanish speaking or Spanish English bilingual households, and they're between the age of 3 and 5. We use primary caregivers' educational level as a proxy for SES. And we ask parents to report children's home literacy environment based on how frequently they engage in book reading with the child and the total number of children's books available at home. We also controlled for children's relative language experiences in terms of how much English or how much Spanish or both languages they are exposed to at home. And for this sample, most of the children are coming from Spanish dominant households, but there's also a mixture of children from bilingual households as well. We used a newly developed assessment tool called the Quick Interactive Language Screener, or QUILS, to assess children's language knowledge and language learning. This is a computerized touchscreen tool that children get to see some pictures and animations from a tablet, and listen to some questions, and then touch the screen to select their answer. And the two examples I just showed you before were coming from this QUILS tool. And the quiz contained English and Spanish tests. Each takes about 15 minutes to complete. And there's no overlapping items or cognates between these two language tests, which means that children's experiences or performance in one test should not directly influence their performance in the other test. Now let's take a look at the findings. First, let's take a look at the SES gap in children's language learning ability in English and Spanish. After controlling for child age and their relative language exposure at home, Spanish versus English, we found that SES was a significant predictor of children's language ability in both English and Spanish. And this predictor alone explained about 7 to 9% of the total variance in children's English and Spanish learning abilities. Another interesting finding is that we also looked at the interaction between SES and child age, and that interaction was not significant, which means that the size of the SES gap was relatively stable during preschool years. It's both a good news and bad news. The good news is that it did not widen over time, but the bad news is that the SES gap is already there at age 3. And how big is a gap? We further divided our whole sample into a low SES group and a mid SES group based on primary caregivers' educational level. And we compare these two groups to see at what age these two groups of children reach about the same level of language learning ability. And we found that for both English and Spanish learning ability, there's over 7-month gap, which is pretty astonishing at such a young age. Next, let's take a look at the sequential pathway. I highlighted the sequential pathway in red just to save us some time. We're going to focus on the pathway in red. So our hypothesis was actually confirmed that children from higher SES background, they experience more enriched or richer home literacy environment, which further predicted better language knowledge and better language learning ability. And this pathway together explained about 11 to 12% of the total SES effect. And it's significant in both the English and Spanish model. Okay, so some take-home messages. We found out that the effects of SES go beyond what the DLRs know about the two languages, that is their language knowledge, to how successfully they can learn new language items from their environment. And the gap appears as early as age 3, and it was relatively stable during preschool years. This suggests a need for future early assessments and interventions to pay more attention to children's language learning ability. It also has some practical implications. For example, in the context of early education, if preschool teachers did not realize that some children from low SES background may be struggling with language learning, they may misattribute children's lower language growth to their lack of attention or efforts or motivation, but miss out the opportunity to help children gain more effective language learning strategies in their everyday teaching. And if people like speech language pathologists did not realize that children's language learning ability can be influenced by their literacy environment, then they may overdiagnose language disorders in low SES population. So it seems like children can engage in either a good or bad cycle. For those children who started with better language knowledge, they may be more successful in learning new language items from their language environment, which can give them even more advantages in their language knowledge later. However, there could also be a bad cycle for those children who had fewer or less language knowledge at the beginning. They may experience more challenges when learning new language items from their environment, which can make them lag further behind their peers. And it seems that home literacy environment can be the key for us to break this bad cycle and turn it into a good one. So that's the first study. Now we've learned about some SES disparities in children's language development. In the next study, we are going to talk about some opportunities to support children from low SES background. And specifically, we're going to talk about how the use of questions might have a differential effect for children from diverse background, so that we need to attend more to children's diverse needs, even within the low SES families. So this time, we're going to be focusing on the quality of language interaction during learning activities. And one key feature of high quality language interactions is the use of questions. By asking children questions, parents can help maintain and direct children's attention during a language interaction. They can also facilitate children's comprehension of the language exchanges and allow children to engage in a back and forth conversation with adults. So in this study, we're interested in asking, do questions benefit all children in the same way? There's been lots of early language interventions trying to promote children's early language development by encouraging parents to use more questions. So very widely used interventions such as dialogic reading focus on promoting parents' question use. However, meta-analysis has shown that sometimes these early interventions are less effective for children from lower SES background compared to those families from higher SES background. And we're wondering why this might be the case. And researchers have proposed two potential explanations or possibilities. The first possibility is that some people have argued that this asking and answering question type of learning is a typical routine in the context of formal schooling. But this might not fit into the cultural style of teaching and learning in some low SES families. In some cultures, children are expected to learn from observing others or overhearing other people's conversation without actively participating in the conversation. So if that's the case, maybe questions are just less beneficial for children from some lower SES background. Another possibility is that we know that there are SES-related variations in children's own language skills. So it could be that questions are only beneficial when children reach a specific skill level, when they can actually understand and answer those questions. And questions may be more beneficial for those children with higher language skills from the beginning, but these children happen to be more likely to come from higher SES background. So to test out these two possibilities, we asked two research questions in this study. Does the effect of maternal questions on language development vary by family SES? And does the effect vary by children's concurrent vocabulary skills, that is, these children's start level? Our participants are 165 mothers and their 2-year-olds, and they are drawn from a longitudinal nationally representative study. To reduce the confound between SES background and children's language skills, we did a stratified random sampling. So we first divided the whole sample into low, middle, and high SES groups based on maternal education and the income to needs ratio. And then within each SES group, we randomly selected children with low, medium, and high language skills. So in this case, we will have children with different levels of language skills across all SES groups at a relatively balanced way. In terms of the measurements, we use a 3-box test to assess mother's question use during an interaction with a child. So the children were at around age 2. And mothers were asked to use materials from 3 different boxes, one by one, to play with the child as they normally would. And the whole process took about 15 minutes to complete. In the first box, there's the children's books. And in the second box, there's a kitchen toy, kitchen set. And then in the third box, there's a dollhouse. We video recorded mother-child interaction during these activities, and we transcribed their language use, and we coded for 3 types of questions. Yes or no questions, such as, is this a tree? These are some very simple questions, only asking children to say yes or no as an answer. And the second type of question is referential questions, such as what's this? What color is it? This type of question requires children to label or briefly describe some basic characteristics of objects. And they can often be answered by a few words or a short phrase. And the third type of questions, advanced questions, such as what will happen next? How do you feel? Why? These questions require children to engage in imagination and to make predictions, inferences, or talk about the internal states of the story characters. And these questions often elicit more complicated and longer responses from children. We calculated the total number of utterances produced by mother and used it to calculate the proportion of each question type out of the total utterances. And that's the variables that we used in our analysis. In terms of our moderators, SES was indicated by maternal education and the family's income to needs ratio, because these two indicators give us almost exactly the same findings. So in the presentation, we're going to only present findings based on maternal education. Another moderator is children's concurrent vocabulary skills assessed at age 2 using the MacArthur Communicative Development Inventory, which is the parent report, a list of words to understand how many words children know at the age of 2. In terms of the outcome variables, we assess children's receptive language skills at age 3 using the Renal Developmental Language Skills. This is also a widely used standard language assessment. So here comes the findings. We first look at how different types of maternal questions predicted children's language outcome. After controlling for some demographic variables, we found that yes or no questions and referential questions at age 2 uniquely contributed to children's receptive language skills at age 3. On one hand, a yes or no question may serve to maintain shared focus between parents and children and to keep the conversation going. Whereas referential questions give children lots of opportunities to practice their vocabulary skills, and they can be especially important at around age 2 and 3, because this is a time when children start to learn the labels of different objects and start to talk. We didn't see a significant effect of advanced questions, probably because these questions are too advanced or too difficult for children, for toddlers to understand at age 2. So now let's take a look at the moderating effect of family SES. When we included family SES as a moderator in the model, we found that the effect of yes or no questions did not vary by family SES, which means that children across different SES groups can all benefit from yes or no questions in a similar way. But we did find that the effect of referential questions vary by SES. As you can see from this graph, the effect of referential questions is stronger for those children from lower SES background. You will see this line. This is for children from lower SES background. So this suggests that high quality language input, such as the use of referential questions, may serve as a buffer for these children to catch up with their more affluent peers. And there was a small but still significant effect for children from mid-SES families. But for children from high SES families, the effect was non-significant. This might be explained by a threshold effect that in these high SES households, children might already experience a pretty rich home language learning environment from other aspects of their environment. If that's the case, then the use of maternal questions may not matter that much anymore. Next, let's take a look at the moderating role of children's concurrent vocabulary size. Again, the effect of yes or no questions did not vary by child vocabulary, which means that Yes or no questions can be beneficial regardless of children's vocabulary size at age 2. And the effect of referential questions vary by child vocabulary, in the sense that the effect was stronger for those children with larger vocabulary sizes at age 2. So it seems to be that there is a massive effect, that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Those children who started with a stronger vocabulary skill at age 2 might be more prepared and more ready to learn from referential questions. However, for those children who started with a small vocabulary size, which is about the bottom 15 to 16 percentile of the whole population, these children did not benefit from referential questions that much. When parents use referential questions with them, they might need to consider coupling their use of referential questions with some actual support, like using gestures to complement their question, or show people how to answer these questions, or ask questions that are contingent to children's attention or interest at the moment. So some take-home messages. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. Early language interventions really need to pay attention to which types of questions work for whom and in what context. For those children with relatively large vocabulary sizes, at age 2, they can benefit from both yes or no and referential questions. But for those children with relatively small vocabulary sizes, yes or no question might be the best choice. And parents need to pay attention to their children's development over time to gradually transition from yes or no question to more advanced questions. So it's all about scaffolding within the dawn proximal development to strike the balance between challenging the children by asking them questions while still providing enough support for these children. And one good news is that we found that children from lower SES families actually benefited even more from questions. So the question is, why don't we see better outcomes for these low SES families in early language early language interventions? One possible explanation is that lots of these early interventions were developed based on some findings from mid-SES sample, and they may overlook the diverse needs of children even within low SES sample. So what's currently sometimes missing in these interventions is to help low SES families understand the different types of questions and help them understand how to choose the right format of question that really meets their children's specific needs, and how to continue adjusting their questioning strategies as their children develop more language skills. Another possibility is that it's not that the strategies that we are trying to teach parents in these early interventions not working, but really it's the intake of these early interventions. Lots of time we directly translate early intervention developed for middle SES families and use them with low SES families. But in this case, the cultural responsiveness and ecological validity of these interventions might not be very high. So if the intervention materials and design are not speaking to the target population, then the effect might not be that large. So now we've learned about some strategies to support children's language development in low SES families. In the last part of my talk, I'm going to talk about some ways to develop culturally responsive early intervention. And this is an ongoing work that we are currently working on to test out this early language intervention we developed for families from high-risk neighborhoods in the United States. So the project is called the DUET Project, Early Engagement, Future Success. We call it DUET because we think one of the most important things for children to learn language is through having this back and forth language interaction with a social partner. So it's like singing a duet with someone else. And the mission of this DUET project is to help at-risk caregivers and children build a strong communication foundation and to improve children's language outcomes and ultimately promote their school readiness skills. One unique thing about this project is that it was developed through the framework of community-based participatory research, or CBPR. CBPR means that the research team and the community partner both contribute to every stage of the project. So instead of developing an intervention for the community, we develop the intervention with them. And community partners participate in every single stage of the project from the beginning, from the very beginning, when we came up with these goals and aims of this intervention project, to the design of the study, to the development of the intervention materials, to intervention implementation, and disseminating and interpreting the study findings. So we have a group of researchers from different universities across the United States. And we also have a community partner called Maternity Care Coalition. This is a community-based organization based in Philadelphia. So they have these home visiting programs in which home visitors go to families from really deep poverty, high-risk neighborhoods to provide some health-related parent education services to pregnant women and families of children under the age of 3. What's really unique and cool about this organization is that lots of their home visitors and program directors were originally coming from the neighborhoods, the community that they're serving. They used to be those parents, those pregnant women who receive services from Maternity Care Coalition. And then they found their services were so effective and helpful, they later became staff to work for the community. So their staff and home visitors really knew the community by heart. So working with our community partners, we developed 5 intervention principles: awareness and knowledge, to help parents understand that what they do in these early years can make a huge difference in children's lives. Creating opportunities to help parents understand that language learning can happen everywhere, every day, and in every language. Conversational duets means to have a back and forth conversation with a child to provide to help the child communicate. And scaffolding means to provide children with just enough help so that they can communicate independently without getting frustrated. And harmonizing means to use all of these principles together in everyday life. So for each one of these intervention principles, we developed a multimedia training module together with some behavioral strategies and real-life video examples. So we created a stick figure family, and the main narrator was a preschooler who talked about how his different family members and friends, like parents, grandparents, uncles, neighbors, interact with his baby sister. And we chose a preschooler to be the main narrator. This is an input from our community partner that we can all learn from children, and having a preschooler as a main narrator instead of a scientist can make the intervention less intimidating and more relatable to our target population. And when we developed this training module, our community partners gave us lots of input, from the narratives of the script of the narratives to how the story character, the intervention characters look like, their skin color change from module to module to make it more inclusive, to their voice and their accent. Actually, most of the narratives were recorded by community members so that they sound super familiar and relatable to the target population. And all the real-life video examples were also recorded with people actually living in the community. So, so the whole scenario looked very familiar to our intervention families. So I'm going to give you one concrete example of how our community partners inspired us in this process. So this is a clip from the conversational duet training module. So at the beginning, we created this ideal back and forth conversation example. So mother asked a question, child immediately answered. Mother asked a follow-up question, child answered again. So everything seemed to move very smoothly. And when we showed that initial draft to our community partners, one community member suddenly asked, so she said, what if the child is being bad? And we're like, oh, that's not possible. Kids are good. What do you mean by a child being bad? So she said, sometimes child don't listen to instructions. They don't want to answer questions. They don't pay attention to what the parents say. And this happens a lot in everyday life. What are you going to do in those situations? Can you still teach them language? So that was a clicking moment for me as a researcher. I suddenly realized that this is what the parents really want to learn about in an intervention, is how to handle those frustrating moments in their everyday life. So we created this specific example to show people how good communication can turn things around, even during these frustrating moments. I'm going to play this clip for you.
In the grocery store, Mom wanted to buy oatmeal. Ashley has had oatmeal before, and she pointed to the big yellow box. So Mom started an oatmeal conversation with Ashley.
What are you pointing at, Ashley?
Oatmeal! Great job, Ashley. Mom, now it's your turn to keep the conversation going.
You're right, Ashley. These are all oatmeal. Oatmeal has so many different flavors. Which one would you like? Ashley, what do you like?
Ah! It seems that Ashley didn't know the word for it, and she got very frustrated. Mom, you need to figure out what Ashley really wants before she makes a scene in the store.
Ashley, show me which one you want.
Mom pointed to the oatmeal boxes. Ashley pointed to a cartoon bee on the box.
That's a bee. This is the honey flavor because honey is made by bees. Say bee.
Bee! Wow! Look at what Mom just did. Mom asked Ashley to point to what she wanted, and it worked. Instead of getting frustrated, Ashley had fun talking with Mom, and she even learned a new word, bee.
Yeah, so that's an example of our training modules. So the Duet project was also implemented through a close collaboration with Maternity Care Coalition, our community partner. We did not have interventionists to work directly with the caregivers and children, but instead we trained their home visitors to deliver the intervention to the families. The great thing about this is that they're home visitors, because many of them are coming from the communication, and they've already working with the family, so they have already established a trusting and pretty strong rapport with the families that they're serving. And so once the family agreed to be part of the intervention, they engage in 6 home visiting sessions lasting 1 hour each. And during these sessions, they first review these multimedia training module with a home visitor, and then parents get to practice what they learned from the training module with their child. And the home visitors are going to give them some individualized feedback on how they were doing. And then at the end of each session, they're going to go through this goal setting process to talk about how they can continue using these strategies in their everyday life. And initially, we piloted the Duet project with 41 families with 1 to 2 year old infants. We did a randomized control trial, and the preliminary findings has shown some promising effects on parents' developmental knowledge, the quality of parent-child interaction, like how often they engage in this back and forth conversation with children, and children's language skills. We later got some funding to further translate the Duet project into a Spanish version. We did not do a literal translation, but instead we tried to create a Spanish version that is culturally relevant to Spanish-speaking families. So we did a series of parent focus groups to show them the wording of the Spanish version, to get their input, and we also added more real life video examples recorded with Spanish-speaking families. And because of COVID, this time we tested it using a light touch remote model where the home visitor and families engage in one-on-one interaction sessions online. And our future goal is to further test out the Spanish version of Duet with both group and individual training and with typical developing children and children with language delay. So to summarize, we talked about children's home language and literacy environment and the role of SES in shaping children's home learning experiences and for children's dual language development. We also talked about how the effects of different types of questions may vary by SES background and children's own language skills. And lastly, we talk about community-based participatory research as a very useful strategy for us to develop culturally representative and responsive early language intervention for children from disadvantaged families. And that's all I have. I'd like to thank all the participants of my study and our community partners, as well as my collaborators. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rufan. Thank you for the fascinating talk. Really interesting results and a lot of food for thought. I would just like to start with one question. Please, if you have any questions, just feel free to put them in the chat. How can policymakers or educators be encouraged to use these findings or integrate them when they're re-evaluating or reviewing the current literacy programs that are in place, especially for low SES children or in disadvantaged areas?
Yeah, I think I can only speak from the state, the context of United States. I think one of the key things that we are trying to address right now in both the practical world and in academia is the issue with the deficit model, that whenever we talk about the work gap, the language gap, the achievement gap, sometimes when we say, oh, because home learning environment plays a super important role in explaining these gaps, and people tend to blame those families or parents saying, you're not doing enough for your child. Why didn't you read to your child more often? Why didn't you get more books for your children? But by saying that, you are actually overlooking the real struggles these families are having in their everyday life. And if early educators, preschool teachers, elementary teachers, policymakers also engage in this type of mindset, this can be really dangerous thing for these families, because it means that they won't be receiving the support they should have from the society. So it's very important when we interpret these findings to pay attention to what we can offer these families, what they really need. Sometimes when we ask parents, like when they say, oh, we barely have any books at home. And when you ask them why, oftentimes the explanation would be, I thought children should be read to by their teachers, or it's very expensive to get Spanish books here in the United States, and we couldn't get them. Or we don't have a car. The public library is so far away, we couldn't really borrow children's books from there. So there are these real struggles that policymakers and practitioners should know about, and that's something that we should really focus on.
Thank you very much. Speaking of struggles or challenges, were there any specific challenges that you personally face when you're implementing the home-based interventions with?
Oh, there's been a lot. So one thing that I can talk about is since we train those home visitors to be the interventionists in the project. Once they got the intervention, they can implement them pretty smoothly, but the training process was really tough because they are not researchers. They're not research assistants that we used to work with a lot as researchers. So one of the biggest issues that we got is that we wanted to do randomized control trial, and randomly assigning families into either the intervention group and the control group. So one question we got from these home visitors is that if you develop this intervention and you think that it's going to be beneficial for the families, how could we keep this intervention, this useful material, from some of the families, but not the others? They thought it was really unfair for those families in the control group. And we needed to explain to them the scientific rationale behind randomization. This is the best way for us to prove the effectiveness of intervention. And this is also the way that we could get more funding and make it a larger scale intervention if we have some findings based on like rigorous scientific findings to show that it's actually working. And a compromise that we made, which I think is great, is that we promised to, for these home visitors and for the community partner to continue using these materials if our preliminary findings show some positive results. And those families from the control group, they're not really the control group, but they're really like a delayed access comparison group that at the end of the intervention, they'll still have access to all the intervention materials. And that's how we solve that problem. But I think if we did not communicate that well with the community partner, then the intervention won't be going as smoothly as it was.
Thank you. We have a few questions coming in the chat, so I'll start with the first one. So Isadora is asking, what strategies can be used to explore different family backgrounds and cultures?
I think based on my own experiences, it's very important to have a diverse research team from the beginning in order for you to make connections with these families from diverse backgrounds. And this is also part of the reason that we work closely with our community partners, because they are coming from that cultural background, they're coming from that community. So whenever I recruit students or recruit research assistants, I often ask my students, your own background, your linguistic background, your family history, and what type of population are you interested in working with, most interested in working with? And sometimes we can get lots of ideas from these, from the people that we work with. And I think there should be a combination of like mixed method study. Sometimes when we do quantitative work to, collect data and look at the numerical like data set, it's very easy to just compare the numbers, saying this group is higher, the other group is lower, without really getting a hold of the reason behind that. So whenever we develop something for people from diverse background, it's important to also combine some qualitative studies to understand the reason behind what we find.
I think you can see the other questions as well. So Mike asking, how much of the SES effect on language development do you think comes from differences in language experience?
That's a great question. So I assume that the differences in language experience you're talking about, there are different aspects of that. So it could be that some children are coming from, say, bilingual background versus monolingual background. And it's kind of natural for bilingual children, their language is distributed across two languages. Their skills are distributed across two languages. So if you combine their skills across the two languages, they may be at a similar or even higher level compared to monolingual children. But if you only look at one of their languages, they might seem to be falling behind, but that might not be the full picture. Well, in terms of the quality of language input or the richness of these learning activities, I don't think there's a good percentage of the variance, like the SES differences are coming from that. But also keep in mind that there are lots of confounding factors as well. So I'm thinking about these language experiences as kind of like the proximal experiences children have within the household, but there are also lots of distal factors that are closely related to SES and also closely related to their language experiences. For example, like the stress level of the parents, like maternal depression, and all sorts of other things that you probably won't experience if you are at a higher SES level, but lots of the low SES families are struggling with that, like long work hours, and crowded households, and like household chaos, or all sort of things can trickle down to children's home language experiences and later to their language outcomes. So it's a very complicated process.
Thank you. I have one last question that was sent to me, but I believe it was directed to you. Do you think interactions with their peers would affect the outcome? Like with sisters, with brothers, for instance, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, there was one study that I wanted to include in this talk, but I figured I won't have enough time. Is when we look at the birth order effect on children's early language and cognitive development, and how that can be different for language minority families versus English-speaking families. So the idea here is that traditionally, I will often say there's a firstborn advantage because firstborns are going to be the only child in their household for the first couple of years in their lives. And they have like exclusive access to all the family resources and parents' interpersonal investments and like quality time. But later that can be diluted across different kids when they had younger siblings. But in language minority families, older siblings can actually have a positive impact on children's early language and cognitive skills because their school experiences can sometimes boost parents' language and literacy engagement at home as well. So they increase parents' awareness of the importance of early language experiences. And these older siblings sometimes can be the main contributor to, teaching children English at home or getting books from school for their younger siblings, all sort of stuff. So when you look at these two groups of families separately, they actually show the opposite first order effect, that there's a firstborn advantage in traditional like English speaking families, but there's a later born advantage in language minority families. So having an older sibling can be a bless for some language minority children. So that kind of shows you how important that peer or sibling interaction is for these children.
Thank you. I think we're running out of time, but we can just take one last question. So someone's asking, do you think children from SES can benefit, I think maybe low SES, can benefit from daycare teachers using a similar questioning method, especially in cases where parents are not present due to working long hours?
Yeah, I think definitely, but the classroom context could be a little different because oftentimes there's no one-on-one interaction, but one teacher or two teachers with a group of students. So teacher may also need to adjust their questioning strategy to make sure that every child is being included. But yeah, I definitely think these question strategies can be useful in preschool setting.
Thank you very much. I think if there are no further questions, thank you very much, everyone, for all the questions. And thank you, Rufan, for your time. It's fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.